The New Testament teaches consistently that Jesus is the giver of eternal life. And in the story of the rich young ruler, he comes to Jesus inquiring to inherit eternal life. The answer that Jesus gives him at the end is, "Come and follow me." So the eternal life is Zoe life, the God kind of life. Does that not indicate that Jesus alone, as the one giving eternal life, is divine?
And then the passage, of course, the passage by itself does not show that Jesus gives eternal life, but rather that passage shows that by following Jesus you have eternal life. And more than this, Jesus said, if you will enter into life, keep the commandments. And the man asked, what are they, how do you read them? And Jesus repeated the Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And it is interesting for our study tonight that in Matthew's reproduction of this story, he omits the Shema Israel, which is an emphasis on the belief in one God. And that demonstrates my theory that there is an evolution in the presentation of Jesus, and the later Gospels are making Jesus into somehow God and diminishing that emphasis on the one God that we know from the Old Testament. There's a departure there from the Christian monotheism into what will later on become Trinitarian Christianity. So when Jesus says to the man, if you must enter into life, keep the commandments, well, that's what Muslims are trying to do, that's what Jews are trying to do. But it was Paul who said you don't have to keep the commandments. The commandments have been nailed to the cross. In the writing up to the Ephesians, in chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, it says that Jesus abolished the law. And we know that Matthew reacted to that by saying in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, that you must keep all of the law, even to the last jot and tittle. Paul wrote in Romans and Galatians that the law is abolished and you're not saved by works. And James responds to that, whoever wrote the letter to James, the letter is named James, in chapter 2 responds to Romans chapter 3 and Galatians chapter 2. Or rather, Galatians chapter 3, Romans chapter 4. So we see that it does not teach that Jesus is God in that passage. It really shows that God is someone else.
It breaks my heart. It honestly really does. That my friend Shabir does not understand the Apostle Paul and has become so biased against him. What he just said about what Paul was teaching is nowhere near what the Apostle Paul taught. And if you would just allow the Apostle to speak for himself, you would see that that is the case. He does not simply say the law has been done away with. That is not an honest reading of Paul. You've got to realize these sources, these scholars, they cut Paul into parts and say, well, he didn't write this, he didn't write that. And so they can get rid of Paul's own words that would correct them and hence misrepresent him. But notice, you just start with the assumption of Paul's guilt. You start with the assumption, the accusation that, Matthew somehow knew, Matthew was responding to this, James responding to Paul. There is no historical evidence. I've written a huge chapter on this very issue. You do not have to read James as being contradictory to Paul in any way, shape, or form. That's not even the natural way to do it.
Bishop James?
Sorry, can I see you first? I'd like to see him then when I ask a question. James, short statement and I'll ask the question. In Deuteronomy 12, 1 and 4 and 32, God expressly forbids Israel from worshipping in a way that the heathens worshipped their idols and their gods, and so that includes the Greek gods and all those kind of things. Alright, so in Malachi 3, God also says that he does not change. So God does not change. But explicitly actually tells us that God will deal consistently with humankind in actual fact with Israel. He will deal consistently with them. Why would he then come in the form of Greek mythology gods and present himself in the likeness of Greek mythology god to the nation that he chose as his chosen nation, and confuse their religion?
Well, of course, it is absolutely without merit and utterly absurd to say that any Christian is defending the idea of Greek mythological gods. And if anyone asserts that the incarnation of Jesus has anything to do with Greek mythology, they don't know anything about Greek mythology, they don't know anything about what Christians believe either. So the fundamental answer to the question is the question is invalid. To answer it more fully in regards, and I've got to start this, and so you just got to let me know here, I apologize. But to answer the question, the prophecies of the one who was going to come were fulfilled, and the writers of the New Testament recognize that. So they saw Isaiah 9, El Gibor, Aviad, these are Hebrew terms, they're fulfilled in Jesus. He is Emmanuel. You have all of these prophetic things that were fulfilled in Jesus. They look beyond what they begin to understand. And in the incarnation, you have monotheism. There is no tritheism. There's no Greek mythology, and any type of even suggestion that there is a parallel there, again, demonstrates a gross misunderstanding of not only what Greek mythology was about, but what about Christian theology is about, what the New Testament teaches. There's no basis for the question.
For my response, I'd like to emphasize the first part of the question without reference to this the part about Greek mythology. Just put from the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 23, verse 19 says that God is not a man nor the Son of Man. And then Malachi chapter 3, verse 12 says, God, I am Yahweh, I do not change. So if Yahweh is not a man and not the Son of Man, and he does not change, and that is the teaching to the Jewish people, then God now comes down after giving this teaching to the Jewish people, and he comes down as a man. What does he do? He makes it necessary for them to think that he's committing blasphemy by claiming now to be a God, because he couldn't have been according to his own teachings. And then they crucify him, and then that turns out to be great, because that was God's plan, to die for the sins of the world. And meanwhile, he had given them a law that says, follow this law and you will be forgiven, and do all of these sacrifices and you'll be forgiven. So nothing really makes sense. How does it make sense to do this? It will have God contradicting himself all over the place. And that's not the proper theology.